MPs right now still engaging in question period before they head to the vote, and some fiery exchanges happening there. Let's listen in live.
Canadians be able to go to the polls. Thank you.
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, from the beginning we have worked with scientists and health experts, and we know full well that Elections Canada has continued to work to ensure that we're able to hold an election in a safe way. But Mr. Speaker, we do not want an election, and the choice is up to the opposition parties whether they want to keep working productively and constructively in Parliament or not. That is what they are facing as a choice, and that is, Mr. Speaker, what we will see shortly.
The Honourable Member for Mississauga, Erin Mills.
Mr. Speaker, online hate is an ever-increasing and pervasive threat that has dangerous implications. We've seen racism simmer and rise. We've seen members of this House face the consequences. We've lost too many lives to despicable acts of violence in Canada and globally. We need concrete action. Can the Prime Minister please inform the House about our progress in addressing the Christchurch call to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online?
Before we go to the Right Honourable Prime Minister, I'm going to ask all those who are at home to please make sure that their mics are muted. There's been some interference there, and I want to make sure that everyone hears the questions and the responses. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for Mississauga, Erin Mills, for the important question and for her advocacy on behalf of her constituents. Too many people have been victimized by online hate, and we've seen the results of this too many times. That's why yesterday we announced over $700,000 in funding to YWCA Canada to examine hate speech trends while developing online tools and digital literacy training for young Canadians. We're also working towards establishing requirements for social media platforms to remove such hatred within a reasonable time or be held accountable. We are working together to address harm caused by online hate.
Once again, I want to remind the honourable members who are joining us virtually to mute their microphones if they're not asking a question or responding. The honourable member for Mission Matsky Fraser Canyon.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister refused to answer the question from the member from Calgary Nose Hill, the member from Durham, the member from Richmond Athabasca. The question is simple. Why is he refusing Canadians an answer to a simple question on how a federal election would be held during a pandemic? What is he afraid to tell us, and why is he afraid to give this House a science-based approach to an election during a federal pandemic? Thank you.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are continuing to focus on delivering for Canadians in this pandemic, on keeping Canadians safe. The members of the opposition have brought forward a motion that is clearly of non-confidence in this House, and they will then need to decide whether they want to continue to work collaboratively in this House or not. That is the choice they get to face. On this side of the House, we're not interested in an election, Mr. Speaker. We are dealing with Canadians. We are delivering for them every single day. The choice is up to the opposition, Mr. Speaker.
The Leader of
Keeping Canadians safe, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has had multiple joint press conferences with Dr. Tam. In September, he said this: every step of the way we were informed by our experts as to how to keep Canadians safe. Today, the Prime Minister's silence is an admission that he has not consulted Dr. Tam or experts ahead of threatening a general election in the second wave of the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister put the health and well-being of Canadians first today? Will he rise in this House and undertake not to force a general election before public commentary and opinion from Dr. Tam and Elections Canada?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the choice is up to the opposition parties, Mr. Speaker. They moved a motion that is clearly not in confidence of the government. They have decided that they no longer want to work constructively in this House to deliver for Canadians. It is their choice, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we're not interested in an election. We have much work to do to continue to deliver for Canadians. The question before the opposition today is whether or not they want to continue to work constructively for Canadians or not, and we shall soon see their answer.
Hear, hear.
I just want to remind the honourable members that calling names that are unparliamentary are not really acceptable, and I just want to remind them to watch their language. I know times get emotional in here, and sometimes things run away, but just be careful. The Honourable Member, l'Honourable Député.
The Honourable Member for Levis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, according to the press, to be appointed a Liberal judge, you must have donated to the party, had lawn signs, and participated in a partisan event, made calls during an election campaign, been a volunteer, and, of course, be a member of the Canadian Bar. Mr. Speaker, are these really the new Liberal criteria for becoming a judge in Canada? This is scandalous. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we made important reforms to the judicial appointment process in 2016. We strengthened the role of independent consulting committees, and we adopted a more rigorous and responsible system that better reflects Canada's diversity. Appointments are merit-based and based on the needs of courts and the expertise of every candidate. We are proud of the highly competent jurists that have been appointed since we adopted this strengthened system, and they come from various backgrounds and of various political stripes. The Honourable Member for Vimy. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for Small Business Week, I would like to highlight that small businesses across the country are the best way to restart our economy. Small businesses have been on the front lines of this pandemic, but they have shown great strength in facing it. Can the Prime Minister tell this House how our government is supporting Canadian SMEs? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. I'd like to thank the member of Vimy for this very important question and her hard work. Companies have always been there for us, and now more than ever, they need our support. That is why our government launched the biggest aid package for small businesses in Canadian history, with programs such as the wage subsidy, the Canadian Emergency Business Account, which has helped more than 770,000 small businesses, the Rent Assistance Program, and much more. Nothing is off the table when it comes to helping our small businesses that are the very heart of our success as a country.
Member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister is hiding behind the opposition and refusing to be open about his agenda with Canadians. While people are struggling with the second wave, they also know that we are facing another impending global emergency, the climate crisis. Just 2 weeks ago, in his throne speech, the Prime Minister made promises to take long overdue climate action. But now the Prime Minister seems determined to go to an election. He's playing politics with our climate and our future. Were those promises on climate change real commitments or just empty pre-election announcements?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, over the past 5 years, we've done more on climate change and to protect Canada's natural habitats than any government in the history of this country. When we came in, a mere 1% of Canada's coastal areas and oceans were protected. We're now up to 14% and on our way to 25%, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to stand up for Canada's environment, continue to create good jobs into the future by investing in transforming our economy in positive ways and ensure that every region of the country plays a strong role in building that better future. Mr. Speaker, even as we are in this crisis of the pandemic, we need to address the crisis of climate change, and this government will.
And that's all the time we have for questions today. C'est tout le temps qu'on a pour les questions aujourd'hui. Comme il est 15h07.
It being 3:07, pursuant to order of Wednesday, 23rd of September 2020, the House will now proceed to the taking of a deferred...
So again, to bring you up to date, we are about to witness a vote that could see this Liberal government fall, sending Canadians to the polls this autumn. All of this happening in a matter of moments. And to break down how we got here, let's bring in our Abigail Beeman, who joins us now from Ottawa. Abigail, so we just heard the Prime Minister say we don't want an election, or the Liberals don't. But the opposition is saying otherwise. There's lots of speculation over the true motivation behind this confidence vote, all seemingly over the We Charity Committee. So are the Liberals trying to desperately hide aspects of the We Charity scandal that this committee may reveal? Or what are the theories that are out there?
Well, that is exactly how you phrased it is the question from the opposition. What are the Liberals trying to hide? What is the big deal that could come out in further revelations on the WE story that they're trying so hard to prevent this committee from being established? So if I can back up a few steps there, this all began when the Conservatives introduced this motion to launch what they were calling at the time an anti-corruption committee. So a committee that would look at primarily, I mean, the WE story was the big headline there, but the Conservatives were saying it's not just limited to WE, but other issues of government spending during the pandemic, other questions that they had about how things were carrying on. So the Conservatives introduced that motion, but then the Liberals came out and said it would be a confidence motion. And that's the motion, or eventually an amended version that we'll hear today. And so that when the Liberals said that this would be a confidence motion, that means if the Conservatives' motion to launch this new committee passes, then the government would fall and then we would be heading to an election. But there's a lot of ins and outs here. The Conservatives were never expecting this to be a confidence motion. The opposition launched motions all the time. It's the Liberals who said, hey, this motion says that your party does not have confidence in our ability to lead. Aaron O'Toole, the Conservative leader, was clear saying that he does not have confidence in how they handled the WE file, but that the motion on the table was not, in fact, a confidence motion. The Liberals, the minority government, has declared that it is, and that brings us basically to where we are today.
Okay, and of course, there's a lot of different ways that this could happen and play out over the next little while, different outcomes that are possible. And it, of course, weighs heavily on the NDP because it's the Conservatives who brought forward this motion. Now, we did hear from NDP leader Jagmeet Singh a short time ago saying that he would not give the Liberals the fall election that they want. Let's listen into a clip from NDP leader Jagmeet Singh first.
Looking at options, but I want to make Canadians absolutely clear that we are not going to give the Prime Minister the election he's looking for. We are going to continue to work for people. We're going to continue to fight for the things that people need, which is universal childcare, pharmacare. They want to see investments in people, and they want to make sure the government isn't spending money on their close friends, the rich friends, that they're spending money where it should go, which is to help our recovery and create jobs in Canada.
So, Abigail, around the time that he was saying this, Singh was also asked what exactly he's going to do when it comes down to the vote. And he was being quite cryptic with his answer, not really saying how he was going to vote. So tell us how a lot of this weighs in the balance of what the NDP are going to do.
That's right. Well, it's all about the math. And as you say, the NDP leader was asked several times, okay, we hear that you don't want an election, but how are you going to vote in the House? And he refused to answer the question while saying he started many sentences with, let me be clear, and then he wasn't that at all. So to this moment, we do not know how the NDP plan to vote in the House on this confidence vote. And just to break down the numbers, it's truly a numbers game in terms of why that is so important. So you have 338 MPs in the House in total. It's really actually right now 336 because you have two vacancies, Bill Morneau among them, two Liberal MPs who have left their seats. So 336 MPs who will be casting a vote here. The Liberals make up 154 of those seats. But what's important to note is when you put the Bloc and the Conservatives together, the Bloc who have already said that they will vote in favor of the Conservative motion, and the Conservatives who obviously have this motion on the table, that adds up to 153. So you can see how close it is. Now there are some other ins and outs here. Before I get to the NDP, I'll just mention that you have two independents in the House. One of them, former Liberal MP Marwan Tabara, who has told Global News that he will be voting with the government. So that boosts the number by one there. But it's extremely close. There's also another topic of how MPs are voting in a pandemic. Will everybody show up? Will the technology work? All of that. But you can see why the NDP become so important there in that numbers game. We also just confirmed a few minutes ago, Global News confirmed that the Greens will be supporting the Liberals in this vote. So that's 3 seats for the Green Party as well to add to that math. But you never know what's going to happen with a confidence vote until it's over. And especially in a pandemic where we have seen, all kinds of technical issues and voting certainly taking longer than normal would be putting it mildly, and we can talk about that process as well, but not going to call what will happen here until these votes take place.
Okay, Abigail, thank you for that. And it seems like you have to be a math specialist as well as a political specialist. As we have mentioned, the Conservatives are pushing to create a committee focused on ethical problems with government spending, and the Liberals say this motion indicates a lack of confidence in their government. So before the vote this afternoon, Conservative leader Erin O'Toole said this is all a Liberal tactic to spark an election. Let's take a listen to what Erin O'Toole had to say.
His designation of this vote as a confidence vote shows that he's willing to put the electoral fortunes of the Liberal Party ahead of the health, safety, and well-being of Canadians. Most Canadians would think that's unacceptable. As I said, there's been plenty of opposition motions where the government has lost the vote because it's not a confidence measure. Our motion even says that. So Mr. Trudeau should stop playing games and put the well-being of Canadians in a pandemic first.
Okay, Abigail, so let's break down what the Conservatives are saying now, saying that the Liberals are just trying to call a fall election and hiding behind this excuse of the committee being called. So what other shots, so to speak, have been fired at the Liberals from the Conservatives?
That's right, and I want to focus in on something that you heard from Erin O'Toole. He said that they've made it very clear that this is not a confidence vote, and actually, as we speak right now, that's what's being addressed. So we're going to have two votes. There is a vote underway right this moment. That vote is not a confidence vote. It is a vote on some amendments to the motion that the Conservatives put forward, and one of those amendments is exactly what Erin O'Toole just said, that this will not be a confidence vote, or that the Conservatives do not believe that this is a confidence motion. So it doesn't really matter what happens with that vote. It's still going to go to the actual confidence vote on the motion, but we'll have to see how this plays out. But voting has begun in the House of Commons on that first vote. Again, not the confidence vote that could call an election.
Okay, certainly a political play that could send Canadians to the polls. That can be a contentious issue, particularly during a pandemic. So is all of this resonating with Canadians? I'd like to bring in Daryl Bricker now, the CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, with a closer look at that public sentiment. Daryl, how are Canadians feeling about this?
Well, it's safe to say that a lot of people that were tuning in today on Global expecting to see their favorite daytime drama are being treated to another daytime drama today. I think a lot of people would really be surprised that another election was being seriously contemplated by our parliamentarians only a year after the last election, particularly in the midst of a pandemic.
And you did mention that it is the one-year anniversary of the Liberal minority government. So Canadians heading to the polls, this is something that's kind of been tested in the next bit. We've seen a couple of provincial elections, or one in New Brunswick just about a month ago, last month. And it appears there that the leader, the premier, was not punished for calling that election. Do you believe that that would happen if Canadians were to head to the polls this fall? Would the Liberals be punished for doing so?
Well, it really does depend. I mean, the assumption is that one election applies to another election. But the truth is, going into this election, the Prime Minister is in a much weaker position than either the Premier of New Brunswick was or the Premier of British Columbia was going into the election, their elections, given public opinion. The government, this federal government, remains fairly controversial with Canadians. And when you take a look at how people say they would vote if an election was held tomorrow, it's no certain thing that the Liberal Party would win a majority. So even though the Liberals are pushing this and the Conservatives are pushing this, the actual outcome of an election is far less known today at the federal level than it was at in either of those provincial situations.
Okay, and before we head on to our next question, I'd just like to mention that the voting for the first motion is now underway. Of course, we are about to see how this vote will turn out, whether this government will fall, and we would head to a fall election. Daryl, just to break this down a little more, the sentiment of going to the polls during a pandemic, are Canadians generally in support or not? And that has been something that has been brought up a lot by the opposition, saying that the Liberals would be forcing Canadians to do something that they just don't want to do.
Well, the irony in these data, when you do take a look at who wants to have an election and who doesn't want to have an election, something we've had in the polling for Global News, is that the people who want an election are basically opposition voters. The people who don't want an election are Liberal Party voters. It would seem like the absolute opposite based on what we're seeing in the House of Commons today, but that's the real situation. But the overall point here is that people would be very surprised that we would find themselves into an election in this particular time period, in this particular context, with this pandemic going on, and all of the parties would have a lot of explaining to do as to why they were being forced to contemplate having to vote again in such a short period of time.
And the realities, too, of carrying that out in all of the different jurisdictions across the country. So Elections Canada had said they would need months to figure out how this could all work across the country. Talk about the complications there that could happen.
Well, I mean, we'll hear that at the start of this, and there may be some bumps along the road, but there have been elections held all over the world. I know I've been working on them at Ipsos, and everywhere from South Korea through to the municipal elections in France. We just did an election in Bolivia. There's one, obviously a big one coming up on November the 3rd. All of the electoral authorities are finding a way to deal with this. So yes, I'm sure that the officials at Elections Canada would rather not be dealing with this, but there are ways to hold a perfectly competent and safe election in Canada over the space of the next couple of months, even in the midst of a pandemic. So that's not going to be the issue. The bigger issue is going to be why we're doing this at all. And right now, that's very unclear, I would say, to Canadians.
Okay, thank you for that, Daryl. We'll check back in with you in just a little bit. So right now, the first voting is underway on the amendment first, and then the confidence vote. Let's watch.
You're sounding a bit distant. Maybe check the boom on your headset. Ms. Fry, did you want to try that again?
Yes, I'll try it again, thanks. Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Very good. Thank you.
Ms. Fry, against, contre.
Monsieur Garneau.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Garneau, contre, against.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Against the motion.
Mr. Gerritsen, against, contre.
Ms. Gould.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Ms. Gould, contre, against.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Guilbeault, contre, against.
Ms. Haidu.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. Haidu, against, contre.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Hardy, against, contre.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Holland, against, contre.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Housefather, against, contre.
Mr. Hussein.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Hussein, contre, against.
Ms. Hutchings.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. Hutchings, against, contre.
Monsieur Yackerno.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Yackerno.
Okay, so what we're watching right now is first the amendment to the motion, and before, or rather after that, will come the confidence vote. I want to bring in Abigail Beeman again just to explain exactly what is happening here. What is this first vote that is happening, and what could be the outcome?
Contre.
Mrs. Jordan.
This vote is an amendment to the really important vote, the confidence vote, that's coming up after this one. So not so consequential what happens now, but it does relate to what I was saying earlier and what Mr. O'Toole said in his presser in terms of they didn't want this to be a confidence vote, and they've inserted additional language that suggests that in the body of the motion. They also offered to change the name away from the Anti-Corruption Committee, which obviously the Liberals weren't happy with. So we are dealing with those amendments right now. And I think from what you were able to hear there, you also got a taste of the Zoom joys or the virtual joys that come along with being parliamentarians in the pandemic. So some technical issues there. Nothing major so far, thankfully, but you can really see how the voting process is more complicated in this situation. We expect it to last about 35 minutes and then again another 35 minutes for the real key vote that will be on the table, which is the matter of confidence.
And I did want to dig into that just a little bit further. I mean, we're really watching, one of the pandemic era votes here in the House of Commons. And this is taking a lot longer than it normally would. We're going to be dealing with technical issues at some point or other. So how are things different now in this era and how things work on Parliament Hill? We're watching all of this.
Right. Well, assuming that most Canadians aren't sitting glued to their television screen watching the average vote in the House of Commons, normally what happens is you have the people who are there in person stand up in the House and vote either in favor or opposed to the motion. The process doesn't take very long. You just stand up one at a time and the vote is counted. In this situation, with a virtual or a hybrid parliament proceedings, obviously not all MPs are there. You saw the pictures from the House of Commons, a real spaced out situation. You don't have people standing up and voting side by side. So in the hybrid model, MPs have the opportunity to participate virtually, which is what you saw happen there as well. That's a whole different procedure in terms of the ins and outs on the technical side of how that vote goes. They start in the House of Commons with the MPs who are present and record all the votes in favor and then the votes against, and then they move on to the hybrid, to the MPs who are participating virtually and do those votes by party. So a little bit different and a lot to keep track of, especially as we talked about before, when the numbers are so important and when this is something where every vote really, really matters.
And we can take a look at what's happening right now and really broaden that out to if an election were called during the pandemic, what kind of complications we could see in general voting for Canadians. And we're looking at a lot of these issues play out in the States right now, but of course Canada is a completely different ballgame. What kind of complications, issues could you see in a pandemic era election?
Well, certainly it's something that Elections Canada says that it is working very hard on to figure out a plan, to figure out a way to carry out an election if one were to happen. But we've seen now elections in the provinces. We have two coming up in the next few days in British Columbia and in Saskatchewan on Monday. And we saw in New Brunswick, the premier there was able to secure a majority government, and there weren't huge issues around the voting process. So it's certainly top of mind for everyone, especially Elections Canada, working to make sure that this can happen safely, securely, safely both in terms of the security of the election, but also Canadians' health, obviously, with the pandemic top of mind, and in terms of those lines that we sometimes see at the polls. Everything would look a little different if we went to a federal election in this pandemic, but a lot of questions, and we hope to soon have an answer as to whether that will be the reality for Canadians.
And the politicians, too, campaigning would look very different for them as well. And I know you were on the campaign trail with the Liberals about a year ago. And so things would look very different this time around. You can't door knock, and especially in today's day and age where politicians are asking people not to door knock for Halloween. How would they get out there and get their message across and interact with people and do what they would normally do during the campaign?
Yeah, the timing of this is funny in a way. Today is the 1-year anniversary of the Liberals winning their minority government, or getting knocked down from a majority to a minority government. Exactly 1 year ago, I was on the campaign with the Liberals at the time in Montreal. So the 1-year anniversary of this minority parliament, and here we are, the closest that it's come to a potential fall. But in terms of those issues with campaigning, you hit on a key one that the opposition leader pointed out as well. Aaron O'Toole saying, we're asking children not to trick or treat. Are you going to ask candidates to go and door knock? That is a big question. Will people be door knocking? Also looking at the different parts of the country and how different parts of the country are affected by the pandemic. Well, look at the Atlantic bubble. So you can't expect party leaders to be traveling in and out of those provinces when the Atlantic bubble means that you have to quarantine once you arrive from outside of the bubble for 14 days. So some local politicians may be able to campaign, but you wouldn't be able to necessarily see the federal leaders traveling there in the same way. Then look at some of the battlegrounds that we've seen in Quebec and in Ontario. Those are also the battlegrounds for the virus right now. So a lot of questions in terms of how politicians would want to do that safely. As I said, it is happening on the provincial level. We have campaigns happening right now, but it's a much different picture when you're asking people to crisscross the entire country, especially from the leader's perspective.
Okay, Abigail, thank you. We're going to take another listen into what's happening with a vote right now as MPs cast their votes or register their votes on Zoom. Let's watch.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East against. Contre.
Ms. Sidhu Brampton South.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. Sidhu Brampton South against. Contre.
Mr. Seekand.
Against.
Mr. Seekand against. Contre.
Mr. Sims.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Sims against. Contre.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Sorbera against. Contre.
Mr. Spengeman.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Spengeman against. Contre.
Ms. Tassi.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. Tassi against. Contre.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Turnbull against. Contre.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Van Bynen against. Contre.
Mr. Van Couverden.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Van Couverden against. Contre.
Monsieur Vandal. Monsieur Vandal. Ms. Vandenbeld.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Vandenbeld against. Contre.
Mr. Vaughan.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Vaughan against. Contre.
Mr. Varani.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Varani against. Contre.
Mr. Weiler.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Weiler against. Contre.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Yip against. Contre.
Ms. Young.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. Young against. Contre.
Ms. Zan.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. Zan against.
Okay, let's bring in Ipsos Public Affairs CEO Daryl Bricker again to break down exactly what we're watching here. Certainly something very different, something Canadians are not used to, which is voting by Zoom, and that's something that we've all had to get used to over the last little while. So much has changed in 1 year. We have mentioned that it's the 1-year anniversary of the Liberal government. So how much has changed in a year when it comes to approval, to the way that Canadians feel about the Liberals in 1 year?
Well, they seem to have improved over the course of the year. I mean, they've obviously gone through some issues related to the WE scandal, but if you look at polling over the last little while, they're given pretty good marks for the way that they've been managing the pandemic. Their party support is up, and the Prime Minister's approval level is definitely up compared to where it was in the last election campaign. But they're not in a position where they could look with great certainty over, say, for example, a 5-week election campaign, knowing for certain that they would end up in majority territory. It's still pretty touch and go.
And let's talk about the issue at hand here in this motion, the We Charity scandal, and how that has affected how Canadians view the Liberals.
We've asked a lot of questions about the We Charity scandal for Global News, and when we talk to Canadians about it, they're not impressed with what they see. They do see it as a linkage back to a pattern of behavior, of ethical difficulties for the Prime Minister personally in particular, linking back to other things that he's had problems with over time. For example, the SNC scandal and the Aga Khan issues. But generally, they see it as being part and parcel of, as I said before, a pattern of behavior that does not work well for the Liberal Party in terms of its electoral prospects.
Would you say it's safe to say that Canadians have been fairly forgiving when it comes to this? And you're talking about a pattern of behavior here. Have Canadians kind of tuned it out a little or become used to it?
Well, they've only tuned it out because the government's decided to prorogue the House and the committees have stopped hearing evidence. Because just before this, when they were hearing evidence, the government's numbers were dripping down every day. So they obviously knew that they had a problem, and the best way to get it behind them was to eliminate the process of committees asking them any more questions about it, and that's why they prorogued the House. One of the reasons that they obviously have stated publicly that they have other reasons, but I think anybody who's a political, anything but somebody who is politically naive would understand what the Liberals were doing. And it seemed for a period of time to be the right thing to do. But it also appears to be the driving force behind why they're forcing this vote today and why they're opposing the Conservative motion, and they're threatening the possibility of having an election by treating this as an issue of confidence, which is very unprecedented. But they also know that getting back into the process that they were in prior to prorogation is probably not going to do them well in terms of their electoral prospects going forward. So you're seeing Canadians are seeing today a lot of political gamesmanship that relates an awful lot to partisanship and electoral potential, very little to do with actual legislation or anything else that I think Canadians are really looking to governments to be doing right now. And they're seeing it play out in front of them today as they watch this broadcast.
And Daryl, I just want to ask you as well, how many Canadians do you think are paying close attention to what's happening south of the border and perhaps dreading or fearing that an election could happen up here now and we find ourselves in this position?
Yeah, Canadians are fascinated by what they're seeing south of the border. They definitely have a point of view on what they want as an outcome. They do not want to have Donald Trump reelected. But, Canadians are also possible of, to use the old expression, walking and chewing gum. You can have an election here and you can have an election in the United States, and people are perfectly capable of differentiating between the two of them. And obviously the only one that they can vote in is the one that's taking place here. So my expectation is if an election was called, we'd be right back into it as we were, a year ago today. That process running up to things, and Canadians would be able to deal with whatever it is that they were asked to do by their political leadership.
Okay, thanks, Daryl. We'll return to you in just a moment. Thank you for breaking that down for us. Let's go back to our Abigail Beeman now to talk a little bit more about what an election during this time could mean. During the pandemic, we've seen a lot of grants, funds, and assistance programs to help Canadians during this time. And a lot of people could be worried about what would happen to all of it, really.
Right, and worried with good reason, because when an election is called and a campaign is happening, essentially, in the past, the work just completely stops and is at a standstill. Here in Ottawa, you certainly wouldn't see any new programs rolling out the door. You would hear lots of promises about new programs from the various parties if it were to come to an election. But the work that had been done up to now would grind to a halt. Now, we certainly, I hear from Canadians every day who are having trouble or had some of it's been resolved, but have had trouble accessing the new benefits that are on the table for COVID-19. A lot of things still resolved, a lot of questions unanswered. That's something that the Liberals are hanging on to, repeating over and over how they just want to get the work done for Canadians and advance the work that they've been doing to help Canadians during this pandemic. But again, I will remind people that it's the Liberals who determined that this would be a confidence vote, or who forced this to the confidence vote position that we are in now.
And if we extend that and look further into the future, if this were to go down that way, those funds stopping, the assistance program stopping, and we've already seen the devastation that it has caused for businesses closing down, down the line, what could we see happen there if those programs were to just stop? And this could mean some serious economic trouble.
Sure. Well, my understanding is that programs that are already underway and money that is already out the door in terms of, the weekly benefits, that would continue. I don't have anything that suggests that would halt in its tracks, but certainly no new advancements or developments would be able to happen in that case. But of course, if there was an election, like I mentioned a moment ago, it would be all about promises from other parties and what each party thinks is the best way forward. Now, certainly every single party is talking about helping Canadians in one way or another, but everybody has some different opinions in terms of how that would work going forward. And if there were an election, that would be everyone's opportunity to pitch those plans to Canadians. But it certainly wouldn't necessarily look like what the Liberals have done so far or put forward so far. And important to note as well, I think that it would really take some time before a new government could get up and running. Let's say you have a 6-week campaign campaign, even if the Prime Minister were to ask the Governor General to dissolve Parliament today, you would still have a 6-week campaign, and then it takes a few weeks for a government to get up to speed, whether that would be, the existing government if they were to be re-elected, or a brand new government, potentially even longer, getting up to speed, getting a cabinet sorted, getting staff in place, figuring things out. There's a lot to be done, so it certainly would not be a lightning fast process. And while the Liberal government has made some lightning fast announcements all the way along here, there's been billions and billions of dollars promised in funding for Canadians. There have been some hitches getting it out the door and launching major programs, the likes of which have not been seen before in the middle of a pandemic is obviously a major challenge. The Liberals are the first to admit that, and that means that it can't happen overnight. So it would be a big question then if there were an election, we're now many hypothetical ifs down the road, but if there were an election and if a new government were to come in, it will take some time to figure out a plan and a path forward. The Canadians that I speak to say that the help that they need it now. We don't know what 3 or 6 months down the line is going to look like, but much of the economy, as you point out, hangs in the balance.
And some of those hypotheticals may not be for much longer. Again, the House is currently voting on the motion brought forward by the Conservatives. Some of those votes coming in via Zoom. During question period today, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Opposition Leader Erin O'Toole went head-to-head on the possibility of a snap election. Here's some of that exchange.
Canadians safe, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has had multiple joint press conferences with Dr. Tam. In September, he said this: every step of the way, we were informed by our experts as to how to keep Canadians safe. Today, the Prime Minister's silence is an admission that he has not consulted Dr. Tam or experts ahead of threatening a general election in the second wave of the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister put the health and well-being of Canadians first today? Will he rise in this House and undertake not to force a general election before public commentary and opinion from Dr. Tam and Elections Canada?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the choice is up to the opposition parties, Mr. Speaker. They moved a motion that is clearly not in confidence of the government. They have decided that they no longer want to work constructively in this House to deliver for Canadians. It is their choice, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we're not interested in an election. We have much work to do to continue to deliver for Canadians. The question before the opposition today is whether or not they want to continue to work constructively for Canadians or not, and we shall soon see their answer.
Okay, so we just heard that heated exchange there between Erin O'Toole and Justin Trudeau, talking about the approval from Dr. Tam and Elections Canada and seeking that first before going to the election. We have heard every party say we need to put the health and safety of Canadians first. No party wants to own up to the fact that one party would want an election, really. So what position do each of the parties find themselves in if an election were to be called?
That's right. Well, as you said, everybody is saying that they don't want an election, and there are various reasons behind it, even though the headline there is that the health of Canadians is what's most important right now, and we're focused on helping Canadians during the pandemic. We don't want to be focused on a campaign and everything that's involved with an election. But there are some, different reasons across the different parties. You look at the NDP, who don't have the finances in place, or who would not be in a good position financially to have an election. You look at the Conservatives, which very recently elected their leader, Erin O'Toole. They want time to get Canadians to get to know Erin O'Toole. When you look at what happened in the last campaign, when Canadians still didn't know Andrew Scheer that well when he was out on the campaign. So that's something that the Conservatives would want to work on. You look at the Greens, they just elected their new leader, Annamie Paul, who doesn't have a seat in the House of Commons right now. She's running in a by-election that is going to happen soon, assuming that things don't change here today with this vote. But there are a variety of reasons there why it would not benefit the parties politically to go to the polls. And then, as you say, the overhanging theme here is the pandemic and wanting to help Canadians first. As we were listening to that clip from Question Period, I was checking on my colleague David Akin, who has a prime view right inside the House of Commons watching this vote unfold. And I would remind viewers, first of all, that the vote that you're seeing now, or the vote that you're hearing about now, is not that crucial confidence vote, but it's a vote on some amendments, that boring Ottawa stuff that most people don't pay attention to on a daily or hourly basis. But this vote needs to happen first on some amendments to the Conservative motion before that key motion takes place. And something that my colleague David Akin highlighted on Twitter there, from his view, he's physically in the House of Commons in the press gallery. We're not there as often as we used to be before the pandemic, because of the physical distancing rules. So he's there right now, getting that really firsthand view of what it's like to have MPs spaced out in person, and then also the screens, making it a hybrid situation. And he was talking about the votes happening now again for the amendment. This is not the confidence motion, but when NDP MPs were voting against the Conservative motion, David tweeted that he heard one Conservative MP clucking like a chicken, and that MP was told to be quiet. But it's that kind of color that's interesting, because things are very different in a pandemic House of Commons. In a regular House of Commons, you hear all kinds of heckling, all kinds of noise all the time. Here, with much fewer people in the House, it's a little different. Perhaps I wasn't there, didn't hear that clucking myself, but perhaps sounded a little easier to hear than when you have the noise coming from 338 MPs. Also, I think we played some tape before, or actually some live tape before of the vote, and you heard the Speaker asking MPs to be quiet virtually, or MPs who are having sound issues. It happens, MPs, they're just like us, figuring out how to get on and off mute. That's an issue as well. So just some of the ins and outs on this very different kind of vote in this hybrid parliament that has become the norm.
And Abigail, you did talk about the clucking and the situation that the NDP find themselves in. Really, there is a narrative here that they're being pushed into a corner and being forced, really, to do things that they feel they don't have all the options for. So the NDP found themselves in a similar situation with the throne speech.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and an important topic to highlight. A similar situation unfolded with the throne speech. The NDP found themselves in a position of power. They said, "Hey, we won't vote in favor of this throne speech unless the Liberal government executes these certain requests that they had, and that had to do. One of them was the 10 paid sick days, which the NDP originally floated that idea and have been campaigning hard for it. And then their other main point of contention was that they wanted the new benefits to be equal to the original CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. Now we have this transitional Canada Recovery Benefit as the government works to get people over to the EI system. And the NDP pushed for those things, and they got their way. They got what they were asking for, because that's how things work in a minority parliament. They were put in that position where they had that power. The difference here is that the NDP don't seem to want an election, but if the Bloc line up with the Conservatives, if they don't want to go to an election, that's the question. Do they have to support the government? The other option on the table, and I believe we've mentioned that, is that the NDP have the ability to abstain from the vote, to not vote at all if they wish. And that's where really when that numbers game down to the wire becomes so important. That's when the 3 Green votes become so important. The 2 independent votes become so important if the NDP were to choose to abstain. But I'm just looking at the clock here, and I know we were estimated at 35 minutes for that first vote, and we're coming up against that now, so I haven't been listening in terms of whether technical details backed us up further, but we are inching closer to that main confidence vote in the House of Commons.
Okay, Abigail, we'll give you a bit of a breather here and for you to catch up a little bit on that. Thank you so much, and we'll check back in very soon. Let's send things over now again to Daryl Bricker and put him to work now. Daryl, of course, we are still dealing with hypotheticals right now as this vote is stretched out a little bit, and MPs are still voting on that first amended motion. So let's talk about what the major issues are facing Canadians at this point if an election were to be called.
Oh, overwhelmingly, it's the issue of managing the coronavirus. And for most Canadians, interestingly enough, it's seen as less of a healthcare issue and more of an economic issue. So it's really about how we get through this process of dealing with the economic damage that's been done as a result of dealing with the healthcare aspects of the coronavirus. So what they're going to be looking for from any political party is really a plan to be able to deal with that. Now, the government's had some ability to put some aspects of what it would do on the table. They had a speech from the throne. They've had a number of programs that they put in place. They've got an economic statement. Well, if they lose the vote today, I guess we won't really hear what that's going to be. But there's been some telegraphing of what they do. The opposition parties, not so much. So there's a real opportunity during the course of an election campaign for the Liberals to challenge the opposition parties to come up with something better, or for the opposition parties to come up with something better. But right now, it's overwhelmingly about the coronavirus, and it's really overwhelmingly even more so about the economic recovery that we all feel that we need.
And we are now 7 months into the shutdowns, the pandemic. How is the public doing right now in the midst of this pandemic, do you think, mentally? We've heard some of the shift to mental health now and how it's affecting people and the politics that are adding to that. Can Canadians handle it, do you think?
No, we really are on the edge. I mean, if you take a look at economic confidence, for example, or social cohesion in Canada, any of the things that we track on a regular basis, we see all of them are well down from where they were last year. Although, honestly, things were starting to trend down before this started. The last election campaign was kind of an upsetting event for Canadians. But they've been trending down ever since, and we're in a pretty precarious situation when it comes to public confidence. So even when you're in that kind of a situation, that's not normally when governments are entertaining going into asking Canadians for their support. And the reason for that is they want to really be going in on a bit of an upswing, where they can claim a lot of credit for what's been done and really capture the mood of positive improvement. We're not seeing that at the moment. So it's really difficult to see, what the motivation is for all of this today. Maybe the Liberals are saying to themselves, look, we're going to precipitate an election campaign because A, we don't want to continue on with this investigation because we know where that goes. But also maybe they're looking forward and they're saying, yeah, maybe things are going to get even worse over the next period of time. So it's a very, very I would say, volatile environment, and one in which an election campaign, even though what we've seen in British Columbia and New Brunswick might suggest differently, when you get into a national election campaign where the attention is far more intense and people are really, really focused on issues of national importance, it could go any way.
Okay, and Daryl, I want to ask you, last time a big advantage that the Liberal Party had was Ford, Premier Ford. This time they have been working with him through the pandemic. So what now?
Yeah, the key to what the Liberals were able to achieve in the last election campaign was they won the 905, which is that big block of seats that sit around the city of Toronto. They way overperformed in the Greater Toronto area, and especially in the 905, where they won almost, I think, everything but 2 seats. The reason they were able to do that was the Ford government was in its early days. It was going through a lot of controversial decisions and was not particularly popular. The Trudeau government used that as an opportunity to beat up on, used Doug Ford as an opportunity to contrast him to Andrew Scheer and say, if you want what Doug Ford's bringing to Ontario, expect Andrew Scheer to bring that to the nation. And it really did move people in the 905, enough for them to be able to win those seats. Right now in Ontario, Doug Ford's more popular than Justin Trudeau. So that lever that they had to use to define Andrew Scheer in the last election campaign doesn't exist for them this time. So it's difficult to see how they campaign in the province of Ontario against Aaron O'Toole, who, by the way, is a native son and comes from that most critical part of the province, which is the 905, which everybody has to win in order to be successful in the election.
Okay, thank you, Daryl. And we're going to take a listen to the feed now from the House of Commons. The first vote for the amendment has been defeated. Let's take a listen.
Got a little bit of a mix-up here. There we go. Conformément à l'ordre adopté.
Pursuant to the order adopted on Wednesday, September 20th, we will not proceed on a vote of yea or nay. Therefore, members from recognized parties present in the House, if they'd like to call a recorded vote, or if the motion is adopted on dissent, I would invite them to rise and to indicate this to the Speaker.
Okay. Okay. We proceed with the vote.
Yep. So all those in favor of them.
I'm sorry. What? Un moment. Favor of the motion and participating in person will please rise.
Mr. O'Toole.
Mr. O'Toole.
Ms. Bergen.
Ms. Bergen.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Ms. Rempel-Garner.
Ms. Rempel-Garner.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Reyes.
Monsieur Reyes.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Cousy.
Mrs. Cousy.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Ruff.
Monsieur Blanchet.
Monsieur Blanchet.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Normandin.
Madame Normandin.
Madame Gill.
Madame Gill.
Monsieur Fortin.
Monsieur Fortin.
Madame Gaudreau.
Madame Gaudreau.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Que tous ceux
All those opposed to the motion and participating in person will please rise.
Trudeau.
Monsieur Trudeau.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. Blair.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Ms. Freeland.
Miss Freeland.
Monsieur Duclos.
Monsieur Duclos.
Mrs. Schultz.
Monsieur Schultz.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Murray.
Monsieur Lemetti.
Monsieur Lemetti.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Bibot.
Madame Bibot.
Ms. McKenna.
Miss McKenna.
Mr. Wilkinson.
Mr. Wilkinson.
Ms. Ing.
Miss Ing.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Monsieur Lamoureux.
Madame Bendayen.
Madame Bendayen.
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Monsieur Seri.
Monsieur Seri.
Ms. O'Connell.
Miss O'Connell.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Ms. Dillon.
Miss Dillon.
Ms. Khalid.
Miss Khalid.
Mr. Algabra.
Mr. Algabra.
Ms. Petitpas-Taylor.
Miss Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Ms. Jazik.
Miss Jazik.
Monsieur Drouin.
Monsieur Drouin.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Singh.
Mr. Singh.
Ms. McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
nous ferons maintenant
We will now call members who are participating by video conference one by one in alphabetical order and by party based on the list at the table. After you have been called, indicate whether you vote for or against the motion. Please ensure your camera is turned on at all times and your microphone is turned on only when voting.
Members of the Liberal Party.
Mr. Amos.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion. I vote against the motion.
Mr. Amos, against, contre.
Ms. Anand.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion. Merci.
Madame Anand, contre, against.
Mr. Anand Desangri.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Anand Desangri, against, contre.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Arsenault, contre, against.
Mr. Aria.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Yeah, against, contre.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Badaway, against, contre.
Mr. Bagnall.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Bagnall, against, contre.
Mr. Batiste.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Batiste, against, contre.
Mr. Beach.
I vote against the motion.
Beach, against, contre.
Ms. Bennett.
I vote against the motion.
Against, contre.
Mr. Blois.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Blois, against, contre.
Mr. Bettina.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Tina, against, contre.
Madame Brière.
I vote against the motion.
Madame Brière, against, contre.
Mr.
I vote against the motion.
Against, contre.
Mr. Casey.
I vote against the motion.
Casey, against, contre.
Ms. Chager.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against.
Chager, against, contre.
Monsieur Champagne.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Champagne, contre, against.
Mr. Chen.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Chen, against, contre.
Monsieur Cormier.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Cormier, contre, against.
Ms. de Brussen.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. de Brussen.
Mr. Brussen, can we get you to repeat? The camera did not click in.
Mr. Brussen, against, contre.
Ms. de Moff.
I vote against the motion.
Against, contre.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Dollywall, against, contre.
Mr. Dong.
Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Dong, against, contre.
Monsieur Dubourg.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Dubourg, contre, against.
Mr. Duguid.
I vote against the motion.
Duguid, against, contre.
Ms. Duncan, Etobicoke North.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. Duncan, Etobicoke North, against, contre.
Ms. Zarowitz.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. Zarowitz, against, contre.
Mr. Easter.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Easter, against, contre.
Mr. Assassi.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Assassi, against, contre.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Je vote contre la motion.
Oui, contre, against.
Mr. Ellis.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Ellis, against, contre.
Mr. Erskine Smith.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Erskine Smith, against, contre.
Monsieur Fergus.
Je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Fergus, pouvez-vous répéter, s'il vous plaît?
Absolument, Monsieur le Président. Je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Fergus, contre, against.
Mr. Fillmore.
I vote against the motion, Mr. Speaker.
Fillmore, against, contre.
Mr. Finnegan.
Je vote contre la motion.
And contre, against.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Fisher, against, contre.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Fonseca, against, contre.
Mr. Fragascatos.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Fragascatos, against, contre.
Mr. Fraser.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Fraser, against, contre.
Ms. Fry.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Aye, against, contre.
Monsieur Garneau.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Garneau, contre, against.
Mr. Gerritsen.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Gerritsen, against, contre.
Ms. Gould.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Gould, against, contre.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Monsieur Guilbeault, contre, against.
Ms. Haidu.
I vote against the motion.
Haidu, against, contre.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Hardy, against, contre.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Holland, against, contre.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Housefather, against, contre.
Mr. Hussain.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Hussain, against, contre.
Ms. Hutchings.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Hutchings, against, contre.
Monsieur Yakerno.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Yakerno, contre, against.
Madame Joly.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Contre, against.
Ms. Jones.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. Jones against called.
Mrs. Jordan.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. Jones against called.
Jordan.
Jordan.
Ms. Jordan against called.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Johari against called.
Mr. Kellaway. Ms. Kara.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Against called.
Madame Koutrakis.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Madame Koutrakis contre against.
Mr. Kuzmierczyk.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. Kuzmierczyk against called.
Madame Lalonde.
Je vote contre la motion.
Lalonde contre against.
Madame Lembropoulos.
So we are listening to the confidence vote underway right now, and let's remind our viewers that the motion is actually around a committee to delve into the We Charity scandal. The Liberals say they would see this as a non-confidence vote. Abigail, so by voting against the motion, and we're hearing a lot of against the motions because, of course, we're listening to all the Liberals vote right now, but would this mean that the Liberals would get a free pass here? Will the questions go away?
That's a good question. I certainly don't think so. I think that if this government continues on as it is, that the questions won't disappear. The NDP were clear about that when the leader spoke earlier today, that they are looking at ways to advance questions on holding the government to account within the existing committees. Remember, this was all about the Conservative motion to put forward, may not have been by this name, but an anti-corruption committee to deal with the issues at play, including, of course, the headline of the We affair. So there will still be questions. You can't expect the questions to disappear if this government is able to stand. Remember, there was just so much surprise that this had turned into a confidence motion in the first place when the opposition was clear that that's not what they wanted to happen. But to bring people up to speed on what you just witnessed there, the voting in person for those MPs who are in the room happened in, I think I clocked it about 3 minutes, but the overall process, we might have another half an hour to go. It's much longer when you deal with the virtual process, and the agreement is that every single MP has to be counted and recognized and say, clearly heard, technology notwithstanding sometimes, clearly heard, I'm voting for or I'm voting against, whereas in person in the House of Commons, you just need to stand up when they're on the yeas or the nays, and then your vote is counted. So much longer process, especially with some potential technical difficulties. But as you said, right now we are hearing virtually from the Liberals, or we are hearing from the Liberals virtually, if I rephrase that sentence. And so those MPs are all voting against the Conservative motion. They obviously have confidence in their own government going forward. But the story's not done yet, and we still have to see how everybody else votes as well.
That's right, and we'll still have to see how the Conservatives vote. Of course, we can pretty much predict what's going to happen there. They are the ones who brought this motion forward for this committee to look into the We Charity situation. But also, there are other skeletons that they're looking to reveal here as well. They have criticized and looked into Liberal spending, as well as conflict of interest. And so what kind of things may they reveal here that the Liberals would not want out there?
That's right. So a few issues on the table in terms of spending questions, conflict of interest, a variety of things during the pandemic. There is an article that came out in a French publication talking about a sole source contract that they are reporting, which was awarded to a former Liberal MP. So that's just the latest thing that had been added to the list. I should say a sole source contract related to PPE. I believe it was ventilators. So that's the latest on the list. But of course, we is the headline, and you saw sort of the ins and outs and the finer details being debated back and forth in the motion. The NDP came forward in an interesting turn of events. What day are we on now? Wednesday. So the NDP came forward on Monday, and they said, hey, we're willing to take Justin Trudeau's mother and brother off the table in this request for documents. We understand it's too close in terms of invasion of privacy. The NDP NDP said, we're okay with just looking at the Prime Minister and his wife in terms of any payments made by the NDP, hoping that would calm the waters. But the Liberals still weren't happy with that amendment. And so then a variety of things happened to lead us to where we are today. But back to your earlier point, certainly can't expect the questions to go away. They were quiet for a while because, as Mr. Bricker pointed out, well, Justin Trudeau prorogued Parliament and the committees had to stop their work, and we didn't hear much about it for a while. But then with the release of some more documents this week, things are certainly heating up again on that WE file and other questions of conflict of interest and spending during the pandemic. And I don't think that, no matter what happens here today, I don't think you'll expect to see them going away anytime soon.
Okay, thank you, Abigail. And at the mention of Daryl Bricker, let's bring him in. Daryl Bricker, the CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, joins us now again. And Daryl, we're watching this vote take place, taking a lot longer than it would have if everyone were present in the House of Commons, but we're getting a sense of where things are going. So let's move on to what would come next. Now, can the House find a way to get back into the WE investigation if this motion is struck down?
Well, that's really the critical issue here, is are the NDP and the Conservatives able to get, and the Bloc, able to get back onto this WE investigation? Because quite frankly, it's the gift that keeps on giving for the opposition parties. So they're not going to get it through this process that they went through today. So what remains available to them to get this back on track? And then for the government, are they going to be able to stall that, and are they going to be able to get back onto what they want to talk about, which they say is fighting the pandemic and pointing out that they have the best program going forward for Canada?
And what do you think the parties are learning from what's happening right now? And I know it's still kind of hard to say because it's still happening, but what are the parties learning from this process so far?
Well, I think each party is learning something different. I think that the Liberal Party is basically learning that they can get the NDP to do anything that they want to do. I mean, they basically got them to support this motion or vote against this motion today for the price of nothing. I mean, that's what it appears to be at this particular point in time. So they obviously know that they can look across the aisle and find a dance partner for just about anything, because today was the just about anything option. The Conservative Party probably learned that they need to be careful about what motions they put in front of the House of Commons that could be picked up and used by the Liberal Party to cause an election to take place. They probably didn't go. This went further than they wanted it to, I would expect today. I'm sure that they would go to an election campaign if that came their way, but it wasn't exactly the way they wanted it to happen, I don't think. So they're going to probably be a little more cautious about how they handle things. And the Liberal Party probably learned that they're in a pretty strong position right now. Their opposition parties are afraid to have an election. And whenever you got your opponents in a position where they're afraid to go to the people, you know you have an advantage.
Okay, some very interesting insight there. Thank you so much for that, Daryl. We'll check back in soon. And because this vote is still virtually happening and taking quite a while, we'll listen in again.
Ms. Zan.
I vote against the motion.
Monsieur Zuberi.
Monsieur le Président, I respectfully vote against the motion.
Zuberi, against, contre.
Members of the Conservative Party.
Mr. Aboultaïf.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Aboultaïf, for, pour.
Mr. Aitchison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Aitchison, for, pour.
Mr. Albus.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Albus, for, pour.
Ms. Alislev.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Ms. Alislev, for, pour.
Mr. Allison.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Allison, for, pour.
Mr. Arnold. Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Arnold, for, pour.
Mr. Baldinelli.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Baldinelli, for, pour.
Mr. Barlow.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Barlow, for, pour.
Mr. Barrett.
I vote yea in favor.
Mr. Barrett, for, pour.
Mr. Benzin.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Benzin, for, pour.
Monsieur Berthod.
Je vote en faveur de la motion.
Todd, for, pour.
Monsieur Blaney-Bellechasse, les Etchemins-Lévis.
Je vote en faveur de la motion.
Monsieur Blaney-Bellechasse, les Etchemins-Lévis, pour, for.
Mrs. Block.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mrs. Block, for, pour.
Mr. Bragdon.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Bragdon, for, pour.
Mr. Broussard.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Broussard, can you repeat, please?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Broussard, for, pour.
Mr. Calkins.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Chu.
Mr. Speaker, I respectfully vote in favor of the motion again.
Mr. Chu, for, pour.
Mr. Chong.
I vote for the motion.
For, pour.
Mr. Cooper.
I vote for the motion.
Cooper, for, pour.
Mr. Cumming.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Cumming, for, pour.
Mr. Dalton.
I vote for the motion.
Dalton, for, pour.
Ms. Dancho.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Ms. Dancho, for, pour.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Davidson, for, pour.
Mr. Diot.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Diot, for, pour.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Doherty, for, pour.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Dowdle, for, pour.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Dreeshen, for, pour.
Mr. Duncan, Stormont Dundas, South Glengarry.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Duncan, Stormont Dundas, South Glengarry, pour, for.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Epp, for, pour.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster.
I vote for the motion.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster, for, pour.
Mr. Falk, Provencher.
I vote in favor for the motion.
Mr. Falk, Provencher, for, pour.
Mr. Fast.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Fast, for, pour.
Ms. Finley, South Surrey.
Motion.
Can you repeat?
I vote in favor of the motion.
Ms. Finley, South Surrey, Right Rock, for, pour.
Ms. Finley, Haldeman, Norfolk.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Finley, Haldeman, Norfolk, for, pour.
Monsieur Généreux.
Je vote pour la motion.
Pour, for.
Mr. Jenis.
Excuse me, Mr. Speaker. I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Jenis, for, pour.
Ms. Gladue.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Gladue, for, pour.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur le Président, je vote pour la motion.
Monsieur Godin, for, pour.
Mrs. Gray.
I vote for the motion.
Mrs. Gray, for, pour.
Mr. Halan.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Halan, for, pour.
Ms. Harder.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Harder, for, pour.
Mr. Hoback.
I am in favor of the motion.
Mr. Hoback, for, pour.
Mrs. Jansen.
I vote for the motion.
Mrs. Jansen, for, pour.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Genereux, for, pour.
Mr. Kelly.
I vote for the motion.
Kelly, for, pour.
Mr. Kent.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Mr. Kent, for, pour.
Mr. Kitchen.
I support the motion.
Mr. Kitchen, for, pour.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for. Je vote pour.
Mr. Kimmich, for, pour.
Mr. Cram.
I vote for the motion.
Cram, 4, poor.
Mr. Couric.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I vote for the motion.
Couric, 4, poor.
Mr. Lake.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Lake, 4, poor.
Mr. Lawrence.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Lawrence, 4, poor.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Je vote pour la motion.
Poor, 4.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Je vote pour la motion.
Lewis Essex, poor, 4.
Mr. Leipert.
I vote for the motion.
Leipert, 4, poor.
Mr. Lloyd.
I vote for the motion.
Lloyd, 4, poor.
Mr. Lobb.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Lobb, 4, poor.
Mr. Lukiski.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Lukiski, 4, poor.
Mr. McGuire.
I vote in favor of the motion.
McGuire, 4, poor.
Mr. Mazer.
Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Mazer, 4, poor.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West, 4, poor.
Mr. McLean.
I vote for the motion.
McLean, 4, poor.
Mrs. McLeod Kamloops Thompson Caribou.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. McLeod Kamloops Thompson Caribou, 4, poor.
Mr. Malillo.
I vote for the motion.
Malillo, 4.
Okay, so what we're hearing right now is a lot of voting for the motion. That's because we are listening to the Conservatives now virtually vote for their own motion. Let's bring in Abigail Beeman now to talk about all of this that's happening. We heard a whole slew of votes against the motion from the Liberals, now for the motion from the Conservatives. But we know the drama, the real drama that lies ahead, that's with the NDP, because just before the vote, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh was careful not to give away how they would vote, only saying that they would not give the Liberals the fall election that they wanted, but not saying exactly what they would do. That's still to come.
That's right, and that meant that that from Jagmeet Singh's words there, the NDP, maybe they were going to abstain, maybe they weren't, maybe they were going to vote against it. It really was unclear. You could maybe look to the first round of voting, remember that non-confidence vote that wrapped up and was rejected, those amendments to the motion. You could look at that as a hint, and the NDP did choose to vote, and they voted against it, that moment I mentioned with the chicken clucking earlier. So you could look at that as a hint, but like I said before, not going to place any bets until this is all said and done and wrapped up. And as you said, we've heard from the Liberals and we've heard from the Conservatives. We know the Bloc will vote in favor, or so they said. The Bloc will vote in favor of the Conservatives' motion, but we still have yet to hear from the NDP on this key confidence motion. So that is still yet to come. They've now been voting for 27 minutes, if my math is right, and it did take closer to 40 on that first round, so still a few minutes to go.
And only some minor hiccups so far. We've seen the video fail in a couple of times where they had to redo the vote. So, of course, that's delaying things just a little bit, although this has been fairly smooth from what I've been seeing. Now, you just mentioned, yes, of course, the NDP still to vote. The Greens did commit before the vote. What did they have to say?
That's right. In the last few minutes, we saw a statement from the new Green leader, Annamie Paul. This was arguably her biggest moment so far, and she has come out so far as new leader, as she's newly elected, but not yet in the House, does not yet have a seat running in a by-election. I see you have that statement on your screen now. So she says that in the middle of a pandemic, there's simply no room for the brinkmanship that we have witnessed over the past days. Fighting over the formation of this committee was never going to be a good enough reason for a snap election. But she goes on to say something important as well, which is that she believes it's important to have a special committee. This is so that the parliamentary committees that have been paralyzed by opposition parties pushing for a deeper we probe and Liberal filibustering can get back to work. And so that's interesting here, because what this is all about, to remind people, is the original Conservative motion on the table is pushing for a new committee to be launched because they were blocked at every turn from investigating these issues, namely the we issue. And so we saw all of the negotiations and ins and outs over having a separate separate committee that could just look at these issues. It's primarily, there have been, I believe, at maximum 4 different committees that had been looking into it. Finance and ethics are the ones that you hear about the most and that are taking the deepest dives here. But the Liberals doing what they can to block that. Filibustering, meaning running out the clock for hours on end. We saw it in the first round before Parliament was prorogued, and then we saw it again in the last few days, dragging out meetings for hours and hours by running out the clock so as not to let the motion pass that the Conservatives were calling for, which was really all about the release of documents and calling for more witnesses and calling for more information around the entire affair. So you see from the Greens then still pushing to have a special committee. She didn't use the words anti-corruption committee in that statement. And again, the Conservatives said that they would alter that language as well if desired. But a big question there. I mean, you asked, how is this going to unfold going forward? Are we just going to stop hearing about this? And I don't think that we will, but in terms of how the work will continue at the committees, that will be an important question going forward. And you know, she felt it important enough to include that in the statement that we saw. I believe that's the first statement that we've seen in terms of how voting's going to go. Although we've heard from most parties there in terms of the specifics of how that vote will go down. But now we are in that final stretch, those last few minutes, hearing how MPs will vote on this confidence motion.
Okay, and let's delve into that a little bit because you're bringing up some very interesting and important points here. If this motion is struck down and there is no special committee to look into this scandal and the We Charity situation, the questions, though, will not go away, it appears. That's what the NDP are saying. The Greens are saying also that they don't want these questions to go away. What real teeth, then, do they have if this motion is struck down?
It's a good question because, as I mentioned, the Liberals were doing what they can to block these things at the committee, prompting the Conservatives to, of course, ask the obvious question then of, well, like, what are you trying to hide? Is there more to it? You had a lot of people around Ottawa saying, oh, that story was done with the resignation of Bill Morneau, or Bill Morneau stepping away from the job, and maybe that's the end of the We story. But when you have the government running out the clock at committee so as not to allow this vote to take place, and then pushing this vote for a new committee to a confidence vote, of course the opposition is going to say, well, then what else is up their sleeve? What are they trying to hide? What are they trying to prevent from coming out here? So I think it prompts more questions, in fact, on the topic. But the NDP said earlier today that they are looking at tools, or they have lots of tools within the existing committee structure in order to look at this. And they were making progress before the Prime Minister prorogued Parliament in that first round of committees now, since Parliament came back at the end of September, getting up to speed and getting working again. But according to the NDP leader, there still are some tools or some avenues to pursue in terms of getting those questions answered at committees. But frustrating days for sure for those opposition members who were facing the Liberals trying to filibuster as well.
And Abigail, this, of course, let's remind our viewers that this is a confidence motion, or a confidence vote, rather, that the Liberals are interpreting this as a confidence vote. But this was a motion that was brought forth by the Conservatives. However, the Liberals are in a position really to stand to gain or lose the most. So what do you see playing out on either sides of that story?
Well, that's the question. Why did the Liberals choose to make this a confidence motion? It does a few things. The first one we just addressed in terms of making the opposition ask more questions about what exactly are you trying to hide if you are pushing this into something that will bring down the government. The other question is, how confident do the Liberals feel about going to an election right now? I mean, overall, the polls have been in the Prime Minister's favor. I won't step on Daryl Bricker's toes there to talk about polling, but overall, in the big picture, in terms of how this government has handled the pandemic, Justin Trudeau has done fairly well. You look at other elections and majorities that were won right here in Canada, in New Brunswick, and obviously that's a Conservative government. But Blaine Higgs was able to win a majority, perhaps a suggestion that people are happy with how the government the current government is handling the pandemic. You look to one of Justin Trudeau's closest international allies, or one that he is closely aligned with, and that's Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. And she just won herself a majority when New Zealand just went to the polls in the past week. So a lot of questions being asked about what position the Liberals think that they are in, that they are willing to take this chance, even though they say publicly they do not want an election, and that has been their messaging overall. But again, as you rightly pointed out, it is the Liberals who made this a confidence vote when the Conservatives said, hey, no, that's not what we were asking for.
Okay, this still playing out, lots of drama unfolding here as the MPs continue to vote, and that is still taking place, taking a lot longer than usual because a lot of it is happening virtually. So let's listen in again to this vote on the opposition motion on the Special Committee on Anti-Corruption.
Mr. Julian.
Monsieur le Président, je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Julian, contre, against.
Ms. Kwan.
I vote against the motion.
On, against, contre.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Mr. McGregor, against, contre.
Ms. Matheson.
I vote against the motion.
Matheson, against, contre.
Members of the Green Party.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Atwin, against, contre.
Mr. Manley.
Mr. Speaker, I vote against the motion.
Ms. May Sanicko-Filans.
Ms. Manley, against, contre.
Ms. Manley. Ms. May Sanicko-Filans.
Oui, je vote contre la motion.
Ms. May Sanicko-Filans, contre, against.
Mr. Tabera.
Je vote contre.
Independent members.
Mr. Tabera.
Mr. Tabera, against, contre.
Ms. Wilson-Raybould.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. Wilson-Raybould, against, contre.
As mentioned in my statement in the House on Wednesday, September 23rd, 2020, and assuming that you did hear the question, if you wish to register your vote and you weren't able to do so due to technical difficulties that are now resolved, use the raised hand function and the chair will recognize you.
I vote against the motion.
Mr. Callaway, against, contre.
Mr. McKenzie.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. McKenzie, for, pour.
Madame Bessette.
Monsieur le Président, je me suis déconnectée par erreur. Je suis revenue.
I was disconnected accidentally, and then I came back and I didn't hear the question, so my vote will not be able to be counted.
Yeas pour 146, 146. Nays contre 180, 180.
I declare the motion defeated.
We'll now continue to routine proceedings. Tabling of documents. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to subsection 32, I would have the honour to table in both official languages the charter statement for Bill C7, an act to amend the Criminal Code.
The House of Commons now moving on to other matters. The confidence vote has been already registered. That motion that the Conservatives brought forward on the Anti-Corruption Committee has fallen. So let's bring in Abigail Beeman now. We saw a registered vote of 146 yeas and 180 nays, which means that the Conservatives' motion does not stand, and there will be no fall election. Abigail.
That's right. So that's the news that we've been waiting to hear for these past hours. The NDP, as suspected there from that first round of voting, the NDP voted against the motion. So at the end of the day, the vote was 180 against, 146 for. So still fairly close when you look at the big picture in terms of this minority parliament situation. But Canadians can breathe a sigh of relief. They will not be going to the polls anytime soon. I won't say how soon because, again, never know what can happen in a minority government situation. But at the end of the day, as expected, the Conservatives voted for their own motion. The Bloc voted with the Conservatives, which they had always said that they would do. The real wild card was the NDP because Jagmeet Singh said that he would not be bringing about an election, but he wouldn't at all be clear in terms of what he actually meant by that, whether the NDP would choose to prop up the government. But they went ahead and voted against the motion, voted in favor or voted alongside the Liberals for this. And then worth noting, because those smaller parties or players were having a lot more, bigger spotlight on them perhaps than usual because of this minority setting. So as we spoke about before, the Greens, the three Green MPs voted against the motion. And then there are also two independents who voted on the side of the government in this one as well. And Canadians will know one of those independents quite well. That's former Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould, who chose to vote on the side of the government in this case.
Okay, and this was certainly something that a lot of Canadians were watching with bated breath today because we all wanted to know whether we were going to be heading to the polls this fall during a pandemic. And that was the big talker of all of this. Now, do you think that the views on the Liberals has changed at all, or what this really means for public perception of our government after what has happened today?
Well, it'll be certainly interesting to see what polling shows, and I'll be curious to see what Daryl Bricker brings back for us going forward from this, what Canadians' take on this was. But as I mentioned earlier, the pandemic has treated the Prime Minister fairly well in terms of the polls, in terms of his response to it. That obviously then took a hit with the developments on the We story. But it will be interesting to see how Canadians read this whole affair and why we got so wrapped up in this and why this all came to be today, whether they will take the side of the government that says that they're focused on the issues of facing Canadians, they want to help Canadians, but that the Conservatives were showing that they didn't have confidence in the government, or whether Canadians will side with the Conservatives who say, hey, we weren't having a confidence vote here, we just want to strike this new committee because there are questions that still need answering. So I'm interested to know what Canadians make of this, whether there is still interest from the average person on the We file, what Canadians make of that, and also what Canadians made of the politics that were at play today, with more people, I think, paying attention than usual with this question of how would an election look in a pandemic, something that most Canadians haven't experienced in their lifetime.
You know, Abigail, you also did mention that the NDP were the wild card here in terms of voting. And again, we did hear Jagmeet Singh saying and was adamant on not giving the Liberals the fall election that they wanted. But they were the wild card when it came to voting. We can only imagine that a lot of them did vote against the motion today, given the numbers. What does this say about their position going forward? And as Daryl had mentioned just a few minutes ago as well, today may have actually shown that they are backed in the corner and will do whatever the Liberals want to do or want them to do.
Right, and the NDP obviously are in a delicate position and want to play that position to the best of their abilities, or to their advantage, I should say. They probably don't want to be seen as, the government's yes people for whatever issue comes up, that the government's going to have their support. But if these lines keep being drawn, and the Bloc has for the most part, been fairly clear in each case. Remember, the Bloc have more seats than the NDP, and the Bloc have been fairly clear their positions, whether they're going to be voting for or against. So, the question is this a pattern, or was this just a couple of times thing? And we'll see how that is playing forward. But of course, if you draw that spectrum from the right to the left, it will be interesting to see how the NDP play this out going forward, and whether they continually find themselves in this position, or whether they play it out to their advantage, like they did with the throne speech, with those concessions that they were calling for, and were quite public about, what exactly they were looking for, and then they got it. So, I mean, if you're the fourth party in the House, that's a good position for you to be in if you can push the government to get you the things that you were promising Canadians you would work for when you're not in power. That's on the plus side. Being seen as constantly saying yes to what the government asks for, that's not quite the same thing. So will be something to watch for sure, how the NDP play this, or what position they are put in going forward.
Okay, thank you, Abigail. Let's bring in Daryl Bricker now, CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs. Daryl, were you sweating watching that vote?
No. We knew what Jagmeet Singh was going to do when he stood on his feet at 1 o'clock in front of the press gallery and said that he wasn't going to give the Liberals the election they wanted. But in fact, he gave them the result they wanted. And I mean, this is going to be the challenge for Jagmeet Singh. The NDP is at a real crossroads. Traditionally, they've been a party that's presented itself as the conscience of Parliament, the one that's going to hold the House of Commons to account, and particularly in minority governments, that they would be the balance of power, and they would especially pull the Liberal Party to the left. They never had any pretensions of potentially forming the government of Canada until Jack Layton, and even Thomas Mulcair for a bit of time, where they really did threaten to be the next government of Canada. And what's happened with Jagmeet Singh is, even though I think he himself feels he had a good election campaign last time around, he lost half his caucus. And now he's right back to the way that the NDP was when they were basically propping up the Liberal Party during the 1970s and 80s. And one really has to wonder if that really is the way forward for the Liberal Party, and that maybe previous leadership had greater ambitions. But right now, what I think the Liberal Party's learned is that they've got the NDP anytime they want them. And as far as Canadians are concerned, yes, they were watching. I would say, I agree with Abigail, that they were watching more today than they have been in the last while. But the reality is, what they've learned is that politicians got to politic. None of this was about anything to do with fighting the pandemic or dealing with the economic situation that the country finds itself in. It was off message for all of the political parties in many ways. So hopefully what happens is we get past this, we get back onto the events of the day, we get back onto dealing with the issues that Canadians really care about right now, which are fighting the pandemic and getting us back into some form of economic recovery. And if that's what this day leads to, I think it's probably a good outcome for the country.
Okay, and some may be thinking that all of today was really much ado about nothing. So how are Canadians taking all of this, do you think? And you spoke about this being off message. Do you think there is the sentiment of frustration that this was said and done and it could be perceived as politicians unable to get away from politics, even in a pandemic?
Yeah, I don't think anybody was able really to put this process in any context that really worked for them. So what it turned into was just really a presentation of political gamespersonship or gamesmanship, whatever you want to call it. And Canadians are never really enlightened by that type of an activity. It comes across as being incredibly myopic and focused on what people in Ottawa care about and not what the country is struggling with. So when the Prime Minister talks about the issues that are outside of what's going on in the House of Commons, he's actually onto something important. But he's an active participant in this too. So I don't think anybody walks away with this situation particularly draped in any type of glory.
And we actually had some technical difficulties with Daryl's video there. This is, again, a pandemic-era live show, so of course we are doing this via video call as well. And we saw how that came into play for this vote in the House of Commons. Let's bring in Abigail Beeman again. Abigail, we saw this new age technology really having a big play on the way that things work in government. So going forward, what did this tell us today?
In terms of the technology, I think it reinforced that it may be clunky, but it works. I think that would be the takeaway here. They've been working on this hybrid model or virtual voting for quite some time. And there, as you pointed out, there are some small speed bumps along the way. You can't hear this person missed the question. We have to come back to this person. Certainly takes longer, certainly is clunky, but no major glaring issues. I was just looking at my phone because I'm hearing from one of our producers, Crystal, who's up on Parliament Hill, gathering reaction from ministers and MPs leaving the House after they participated in the vote. And her best reaction so far, I think, was from the Environment Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, who was asked, so are you going to put your election signs back yet? And he said, never taken them out. So just starting to get some reaction now. I do hear that the government House leader, Pablo Rodriguez, is going to be speaking soon. So we will be waiting to hear how MPs react to this. We heard from Minister Catherine McKenna, who said that now it's just time to get back to work as well. So I think a sigh of relief is probably fair across all the parties, although, again, it's the Liberals who pushed this to a confidence vote and the other parties who said, hey, we didn't ask for that in the first place. But here we are, that motion fails and Canadians will not be going to the polls this fall.
Okay, Abigail, in about 30 seconds left, your final thoughts on this. Was this much ado about nothing?
I suppose it was, looking at what this outcome was, but what it did do was remind Canadians that the opposition is still pushing for pushing for answers that have not yet been answered. So still waiting to see how the opposition chooses to move forward on those questions.
Okay, thank you, Abigail. Again, breaking news is that Canadians will not be heading to the polls this fall. You're watching Global News.